Philosophers often try to clarify our ordinary concepts that we usually take for granted. So, for example, they might ask a question like, what is time? Or what is a person? Or what is knowledge? Now, what are they asking when they ask a question like that? Well, they're looking for something like the essence of that thing. They're looking for a description of it that all and only the instances of that thing will satisfy. Here's another way of putting it. They're looking for the necessary and sufficient conditions for being, say, a person, or for being knowledge, or for being time. This may sound kind of abstract. I'm going to illustrate it here in a minute. Now, in your reading, Barker calls these kinds of definitions of the essence of a thing revelatory definitions. And he contrasts them with two other kinds of definitions. So you've got analytical definitions. Those are just like dictionary definitions. Here's what we mean in the language when we use a word like person. You know how to use the word person pretty well. There's also stipulative definitions. A stipulative definition says, I'm going to give it this word a special meaning. So when I say this truck is heavy, I'm going to mean that that truck can carry 5 tons or more. Now, you might think a truck is heavy if it weighs more than 50 pounds because it's hard to lift. But I'm going to use it in the special sense, which I'm stipulating right now. That's a stipulative definition. In philosophy, when we're doing conceptual analysis, we're looking for this third kind of definition. We don't solve our questions by looking up the definition in a dictionary. That's not how we resolve conceptual questions in philosophy. And we don't always just stipulate a definition, although sometimes that's useful. But what we're looking for often is a revelatory definition. And Barker says that these are definitions that perfect the tendencies of thought that are implicit in old usages and offer more insight into the subject matter being treated. That's a sort of helpful description. Here's the example he gives us. So before Isaac Newton came along, the word force was a good old English word that you could use, and people knew how to use the word force. But when Newton came along, he said, hey, I've got a deeper insight into what force really is. Force really is mass times acceleration. And that was revelatory. He took this old word and showed us what it really meant, even though we thought we knew what it meant before. That's sort of like what philosophers are going for when they do conceptual analysis. Now, let me illustrate how this works in philosophy with a case study from Plato's Meno dialogue. So the dialogue, like all of Plato's dialogues, record a conversation between Socrates, who might be the most famous philosopher of all time, and another guy named Meno. So Plato was Socrates' student. Socrates didn't write anything down, but Plato wrote all these dialogues about what the conversations that Socrates had. And that's how we get Plato's dialogues, which are all about Socrates. So in this, and they always name the dialogue after whatever clown Socrates is debating. So in this particular one, the Socrates and Meno are debating the meaning or the essence of virtue. And here's how the conversation starts. Meno asks Socrates a question. He says, can you tell me, Socrates, is virtue something that can be taught? Or does it come by practice? Or is it neither teaching nor practice that gives it to a man, but just natural aptitude or something else? So he's asking about how we become virtuous. But in order to answer that question about how do we become virtuous, they first have to figure out another question. What is virtue? And here's how they proceed. So that's what Socrates asked Meno. He says, well, Meno, I can't answer this until you tell me what virtue is. And so Meno says, okay, look, sure, I can tell you what virtue is. No problem. First, if you want the virtue of a man, it's easy to say that man's virtue consists of being able to manage public affairs, and in doing so, to benefit his friends and harm his enemies, and to be careful that no harm comes to himself. If you want the virtue of a woman, that's not difficult to describe either. She must manage the home well, preserve its possessions, and be submissive to her husband. The virtue of a child, whether male or female, is different again. And so is that of an elderly man, if you want that, or if you want that of a free man or a slave. There is virtue for every action in every age, for every task of ours in every one of us. And Socrates, the same is true for wickedness. Now, maybe the first thing that gets your attention about this answer is that you don't like this kind of social hierarchy that Meno presupposes. Well, men should do one thing and women another, and slaves and free. Maybe you don't like that. Just set that aside for a second and play along. I mean, those are important questions. But Socrates has a different kind of objection to Meno's first attempt to define virtue. And here's Socrates' objection. He says, you've just given me different examples of virtue, but not a definition of virtue itself or the essence of a virtue. So let's say I was talking about rabbits. Meno has said, well, look, Socrates, there's a rabbit, and there's a rabbit, and there's another rabbit. I see it. Here's a bunch of examples. And Socrates says, I don't want examples of rabbits. I want a definition of the species. It's, small furry animals with cottontails and floppy ears. That's the definition, the essence of rabbithood. And you haven't given me that, man. A good definition is going to give us the necessary and sufficient conditions of the definiendum, the thing we're trying to define. It's going to give us the characteristics that all and only these sorts of items, virtuous actions or virtuous people, have. Okay, so with that clarification, Meno tries again. He says, all right, got it. Virtue, Socrates, is the ability to rule over people. All right, well, that's the right kind of thing to be answering. But Socrates has another objection. Socrates objects, wait a minute, I've got some counterexamples to that. For one thing, he says, there are slaves and children who can be virtuous. We all agree with that. But they don't have the ability to rule over others. And what that shows us is that the ability to rule is not necessary to virtue. Not all virtuous people have this ability. He's also got an objection, a counterexample from the other direction. He says, unjust rulers are not virtuous. So the ability to rule over others is not sufficient to make you virtuous. It's not a characteristic that only the virtuous people have. Now, this illustrates two important things about conceptual clarification. First, we test definitions by looking for counterexamples, and you will do the same thing. So you'll ask the question, are there any instances of this item, say virtue, that don't meet the conditions stated in the definition? If so, then those conditions are not really necessary conditions, since they don't apply to all the instances of that item. On the other hand, you can ask, are there any items that meet the definition's criteria, but are clearly not instances of that item, say virtue? If so, then those conditions are not really sufficient conditions, because they don't apply only to instances of the item. Okay. Meno gives it a third try. He says, I got it, Socrates. Justice is virtue, and virtue is justice. The two are identical. Well, you try it now. Think about a counterexample. Is there anything that's virtuous or that is virtue that's not justice? And on the other hand, is everything that is just also virtuous? Well, Socrates thinks that justice is always virtue, but he doesn't think that justice is the only virtue. So justice isn't necessary for virtue. There's other virtues besides justice, say courage or mercy or loyalty or whatever. Not all virtue is justice. Well, Meno gives it a fourth try. He says, virtue is to desire good or beautiful things and to have the power to acquire them. Now, they have a really interesting conversation about this fourth account, but basically Socrates has two objections here. First of all, desiring good things and having the ability to acquire them unjustly is not virtuous. So that's an objection. This first objection is an objection to the sufficiency of Meno's account. So that's a big problem. Well, where does that leave us? What is virtue? What was the right answer that they get to? Well, they don't explicitly get to a right answer in the dialogue, although you should read the whole thing. And that's often the case with Socrates and often the case with philosophy. Sometimes you don't arrive at a positive, satisfying answer. But they did make progress along the way because they eliminated some bad answers. But the point of this example is to show you how conceptual analysis and conceptual clarification work. You propose a definition of the essence of something, and then you look for counterexamples to that definition. Now, in this class, there's several concepts that we'll be analyzing along the way. Here's a few that we might get to. Goodness and badness. Rightness and wrongness. Personhood. What is a person? Identity. What is it for one thing to be the same thing now as it was yesterday? That's a complicated question. Nature. For example, what sorts of actions are natural actions? Or is that even a meaningful term? Justice. What is justice? What is free will? What is knowledge? These are all super interesting, super important concepts which deserve our reflection.